Our keynote speaker, I think, from my own personal perspective, there are a handful of people who really inspired me to do as much as I could possibly do in creative work with kids. And Gary Steger, Dr. Gary Steger, is one of those people. I first heard Gary Steger speak at a conference in Maine with, I think, his mentor, Seymour Papert. And I strode to Maine to see those two gentlemen speak and have been inspired ever since, and I followed Gary's work. Gary has a really long list of credentials, which I won't bore you with, but he's easily findable online. He is the director of a conference called Constructing Modern Knowledge in Manchester, New Hampshire. He's worked with students all over the world and inspired tons of people. He's worked with the folks from MIT. He has worked in incredible projects in Australia's most troubled public schools, launching a one-to-one program there many decades ago. He has been published all over the place, District Administration, Converge Magazine, all kinds of things. He's a visiting scholar in many places. The part that I love about his speeches, I think it's a real treat to be here today if you've never seen him speak, because there's a common sense thread in this, and it's about simplicity. Oftentimes schools get buried in bureaucracy and it's hard to move things, but Gary's speeches I've always found really cut to the chase about the simplicity of working with kids, that this doesn't really need to be that complicated, and we can work with them and learn with them. He's also a jazz musician. Most people don't know that, and he's been involved in Grammy Award productions and all kinds of things. I find him to be one of the most creative, fun people that I get a chance to talk to. His latest book is called Invent to Learn. He's got a couple books in queue that he told me about last night, but I'll let him do that. If you could put your hands together, please, for Dr. Gary Steger.
Well, thanks to Adam and the committee for the warm introduction and invitation to return to Vermont. I always relish the opportunity to speak here in Vermont, because I feel like I should open the presentation by saying I'm here from a place called the United States, and I want to tell you about education. I like the fact that much of the bad stuff that's happened in the other 49 states has been ignored by you fairly successfully. I couldn't help but notice when I landed at the airport, though, that you seem to have some acute food issues. I was confronted by both the chubby muffin and the skinny pancake. Looking around this room, I was having flashbacks to a conference I did a few years ago where I was a keynote speaker, the second keynote speaker at Villanova, and I was in their basketball arena. And the first keynote speaker was their basketball coach, who people were sort of looking at reverentially, and I thought, oh geez, how do I follow the basketball coach who's been treated like God at this place? So I came up with this killer opening line, and I said, I'm here to represent all the kids who had special gym. And I'm glad you laughed, because none of them did. And the open bar reminded me of, I spoke in Red Deer, Alberta in Canada a couple months ago, and at the end of the conference they moved everyone into the student center, and there was drink coupons given, and you were going to get 2 beers or something. But first you had to listen to a 20-minute lecture from a woman wearing an I Love Oil shirt, where she said things like, when you hear Hollywood liberals like Robert Redford say bad things about oil, you need to tell them that they're out of line. And I thought, now I know exactly what the price of a teacher is. It was apparently 2 drink tickets. Everyone was very well-mannered, well-behaved about it. I was losing my head. And anyway, let's get on with the show. My keynote this morning is called Making, Love, and Learning, and the comma placement is critically important here. Because I want to talk about making, and I want to talk about love, and I want to talk about learning. One way we can stay in touch is if you send an email of any sort to hey@stager.org, you'll receive a digital handout in return, and a very occasional newsletter. I just got the summer 2008 edition out. but it's a way for us to continue the conversation as we go forward. Now, I'm not surprised when kids do extraordinary things. I'm surprised when adults are surprised that kids are capable of doing extraordinary things. I've come to expect it. I was showing Adam video last night of a 9-year-old sitting in with some of the greatest jazz musicians in the world in a club in Manhattan the other night. And the kid could play. He wasn't up there as a novelty. He was there because he was part of the community of practice and because he wanted access to that expertise and he wanted to be part of something larger than himself. Kids are capable of doing extraordinary things, and computers in particular are intellectual laboratories, vehicles for self-expression, ways of amplifying human potential, allowing kids to go further than they could have gone on their own. You know, some people are excited that we can use the computer to teach things we've always wanted kids to know with maybe greater efficiency or efficacy or comprehension or stickiness. But what really drives my work isn't using the computer to make school 0.02% better, but to create radically different, more diverse, deeper, more creative, more intimate learning experiences than would have been possible otherwise. As Adam said in the introduction, I led professional development at the first 2 schools in the world where every kid had a laptop. That was 24 years ago. The fact that we're still arguing about whether kids should have access to a computer today is kind of horrifying. There are actual history books written about that work. But this is a photograph I took in the early 90s in Australia where kids were programming in Logowriter, which was a predecessor to Microworlds or Scratch. And in the time that elapsed between hitting the return key and awaiting the result to appear on the screen, every ounce of this kid's being was mobilized in anticipation of the result. You can see he's actually shaking with anticipation. I want kids to wake up in the middle of the night excited about returning to school to work on projects that they couldn't have done anywhere else, with access to expertise and caring adults and a community that supports them to go further than they would be able to go on their own. I want teachers to wake up every morning and ask themselves the question, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life? And in this case, and in hundreds since, a teacher took me aside and said, yeah, that kid's not very good at school. And one of the ideas that's really been driving my work and was kind of the impetus for the book Invent to Learn, Making Tinkering and Engineering in the Classroom, which we published in the last year, was something that Leon Botstein, the president of Bard College in New York State, said in a completely different context. But he's one of our leading public intellectuals, and he said something that really shook me and has shaped my thinking for the last better part of a decade. Botstein said that young people have a remarkable capacity for intensity. Young people have a remarkable capacity for intensity. And it's incumbent upon all of us to build upon that capacity for intensity, otherwise it manifests itself as boredom or misbehavior or ennui, or perhaps just worst of all, wasted potential. And I mentioned a moment ago that I've heard over and over and over again teachers taking me aside and telling me that a kid who shows that level of passion isn't very good at school. And it really came into focus for me a couple months ago when I was working in one of the world's most elite private schools overseas. I was in Asia. And I walked into this 5th grade class, and I said, hi, I'm Gary, let's get busy. I never have issues with classroom management because I never feel like I need to manage a classroom. And there must be a big invisible kick me sign on my forehead or on my back or something because schools routinely ask me to teach all of the 6th graders at once. So I taught 150 6th graders recently, or for 3 hours, no one was removed from the classroom, no one was shushed. We just got busy. So I walked into this 5th grade classroom and I said, hi, I'm Gary. I introduced this software called Turtle Art, this programming language. This one kid was on fire instantly. I'd give him a challenge, he'd kill it. He'd come up with his own challenge, he'd overcome it. He looked around the room and realized that some of his classmates were having trouble trying to understand a particular concept. He took it upon himself to go to the teacher's computer, led an impromptu tutorial for his classmates, sat back down at his computer. I gave him a new challenge. I told him I was going to sit at the teacher's computer. I was going to solve the problem in a completely different way. I said, nah, I beat you. I named the file Gary Defeats Derek. The kid took it in good stead, had a good sense of humor about it. And later on that day, he chased me down the hall because he wanted to tell me all the things that he had learned and tried since I had been in his class earlier that day. I said, oh, that's terrific. We had a nice, quick conversation as I was walking to the next class. And then my colleague turned to me, and it happened again. He said, and we're throwing that kid out of our school because apparently he doesn't comply or color within the lines. And that's when it occurred to me that what's going on here is that there's a remarkable intensity imbalance. between what these kids are capable of doing, between what they want to do, what they're interested in doing, and what school is allowing them to do for that 6 hours a day in a $7 plastic chair. You know, we need to be using computers in ways that expand the human potential, that don't just merely drill kids or surveil them or deliver curriculum. There are powerful, moneyed interests in this culture who want to replace each and every one of you with a YouTube video. And we need to resist that with every ounce of strength that we have. In order to do so, we need a very different, more expansive notion of computing, a vision of computing that's worthy of the child, that's in a continuum of cardboard and paper mache to microcontrollers. That despite the other things that are happening in education today, we have the coolest materials available that have ever existed before that can be used for constructing knowledge, for expressing one's interests and talents and passion. I firmly believe that making things is better than being passive. Piaget said knowledge is a consequence of experience. I think the primary responsibility of schools is to democratize access to experience and expertise. Having said that, making good things is even better. A lot of what we're doing with computers in schools is quite trivial and beneath the capabilities of the kids. And some of the examples I'm going to show you this morning, you might think of as utopian or can't imagine how this could ever happen in your classroom. I would encourage you to sort of suspend your disbelief, because almost every example I'm going to share with you was done by a kid the first time they had ever confronted the materials. None of us know what these kids would be capable of doing if the adults didn't have attention deficit disorder and were able to sustain the interests and passions of the kids over a prolonged period of time. You know, I talked about laptops in Australia. Every prime minister of Australia since the 90s talks about, you know, beating Finland or Shanghai or whoever the latest, you know, threat is. But they missed the fact that we taught a couple 100,000 fifth and sixth graders to program in the early 90s. And what would have been possible if the adults had allowed that to continue past 7th grade? What could kids actually be capable of? We don't have any idea, and we need to find out. We need to stop, you know, laminating pictures of kids' mind maps and putting them up on the wall as exemplars of the brilliant things they can do with computers, and actually celebrate what they're capable of doing. As educators, we need to be aware of trends, larger societal trends, that not only can point us perhaps in an alternative direction, but also be used to buttress our arguments for making classrooms more progressive, more child-centered, more joyful. One of those trends that I think is really exciting is the do-it-yourself movement, sometimes referred to as the maker revolution. Over the past decade or so, there's been a renewed interest in solving our own problems, in doing it ourselves. Up until then, we've gone through a couple decades, perhaps a generation or two, of consumerism and helplessness, and when confronted with a challenge and the choice of hire a pro or do it ourselves, we've hired a pro. And now there's been a renewed interest in craft traditions, and not only craft traditions, but making things with new materials, with digital materials, with materials that bridge the gap between the analog and digital. And it manifests itself in literature like the Geek Dad series of books and 50 Dangerous Things Your Kid Should Do and Why, and Made by Hand, and How-Toons, and the Instructables website, and Make Magazine. But it's also represented by reality television, which I find to be a really positive trend. That might surprise you, but in a culture that's increasingly devoid of apprenticeship experiences, and where I meet an alarming number of young people who have never had a conversation with an adult. You know, they've been bossed around and named and labeled and sorted and ranked and graded and shamed, but they've never fixed the car with an uncle or gone fishing with a neighbor. Reality television provides a venue for having access to expertise, for having vicarious apprenticeship experiences. So now if you want to learn how to dance the paso doble or bake a souffle or build a shed or be a drunken loser, there's some expert mentor available to you. Now, in our book, we identified 3 technological game changers sort of technological bushels, if you will, that represent some of the new materials and some of the new opportunities for learning that have never existed before. The first one is fabrication, the idea that until very recently, if you wanted to make something with a computer, the only thing you could make lived on a screen or resided on paper, but now you can actually make real things with 3D printers and laser cutters and such. We shouldn't lose our heads about this. We should recognize that the real power behind this process is in the design, in the creative and intellectual work that goes into planning something, of creating it in 3 dimensions, not having every 7th grader print an identical Yoda keychain. It's as if we were to replace the English literature curriculum with Helvetica or laser printing. The real meat of this is the design process. The second area doesn't get as much attention as it should, but it's probably the most important of the game changers, and it's physical computing. You could think of this overly simplistically as robotics, but more broadly as adding intelligence and interactivity to everyday objects. That we're now able to create circuits with conductive ink pens or use a wearable microcontroller that allows us to have a sweatshirt with directional signals in the back, or a necklace that alerts us when our least favorite teacher is approaching. Where we can embed electronics into cardboard and paper and make greeting cards that sing and cardboard that dances. And this microcontroller revolution creates a whole host of new ways to express knowledge and for kids to be engaged in science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Real science, technology, engineering, mathematics experiences. One of the great things about the maker movement is that until very recently, school was always about simulacrum of experience. You could model things, you could prototype things, you could never make real things. Now kids have the ability to make real things. And there's no more authentic context for learning than for real learning by making real things. And the third game changer is computer programming. There are lots of arguments about kids should be learning to code. Apparently that's the word now. Because it'll help them get jobs. Bill Gates says if you can cut code, you're worth $100,000 a year, as long as you're not over 25, or female, or of color, or American. But the real reason why kids should learn to program is because it gives them agency over an increasingly complex world. Seymour Papert asked the question in the late 1960s, which remains important today, and now it is, does the computer program the child or the child program the computer? And kids ought to be programming in order to control all of the other technologies and in order to become expert in any field of endeavor they choose to enter. That having agency over the computer in an increasingly complex, technologically rich world is critical for every kid. So we have this convergence of powerful ideas of science, technology, and engineering mathematics, of learning through firsthand experience, through prototyping and fabricating and making intelligent machines with all sorts of new ways of creating circuitry, whether it's copper tape or squishy circuits, which is conductive and non-conductive, or conductive and insulating Play-Doh that kids can stick batteries and bulbs and buzzers and things into and make Play-Doh conduct electricity. The makey-makey, which can turn anything in the world into an interface for the computer, allows you to make wind chimes that play the tuba or hip-hop licks, or turn your school stairs into a piano, or you're going to see later teachers who put the circulatory and digestive system on a t-shirt, and when they pointed to places on their body, a tutorial was played on the screen. In craft traditions, we're not only preserving craft traditions, we're using craft traditions to humanize, to soften, to broaden the appeal, and to extend the capabilities of the technological tools that are available to us. If you go to Maker Faire, you're as likely to see a room full of a landscape made out of masking tape or people sewing and crocheting and knitting as you are likely to see welding and fire-breathing robots. And there's a continuity between all these experiences where making things by learning by making is consistent across all of them. It creates new intergenerational learning opportunities, which I'll talk about in a moment. And I think this might be our last shot at progressive education and keeping schools viable. I'm not a futurist, but I will make one prediction about the future of education, and that is your schools in the very near future will not enjoy the monopoly on children's time you currently hold. Let me say that another way. Kids won't go to school as much as they do today. And the reason why I know I'm 100% right about that prediction is that every politician on earth says the exact opposite. But we know that when we were an agrarian society, kids stayed home with their parents. When parents went off to factory jobs, the kids went off to factory schools. Everyone I know works from home at least part of the time. If for no other reason than they're sick and tired of waking their kids up before sunrise to strap them to a bus to go to a place they don't want to be, I don't think you're going to have the monopoly on kids' time that you currently hold. Then the challenge becomes, why is it that kids come to school? And how do we gain the greatest benefit from being co-located in the same physical space at the same physical time? And paradoxically, the reasons to come to school are the first things we devalue and cut. Band, science labs, field trips, working on projects, making things. That's stuff you can't look up online. We can come together to have these common experiences. And I think that the maker movement represents perhaps our last chance to bring the ideas of Dewey and Piaget and Papert and Petrie and Holt and project-based learning and classroom centers and thematic units of inquiry back to life. I'm leaving from here to fly to San Francisco to the big Maker Faire in San Mateo. There were 100 Maker Fairs around the world last year, places where kids of all ages come together in what they call the greatest show and tell on earth. And even the fact that they call it the greatest show and tell on earth is interesting because show and tell used to be something we did in school. And now that's happening outside of school as well. If you go to Maker Faire, you'll see giant mouse traps and people driving cupcake cars and Barca loungers and building robots out of cardboard and welding and soldering and knitting and sewing and painting and programming. There are lock-picking classes you can take. And everywhere you look, there are children and adults learning together and making and creating together, including the rather creepy guy with the spaceship he drives around with that parents let their children into. That there's this wonderful community of practice, there's this wonderful energy. We talk a lot about, we need parental engagement, we need parents who are involved in their kids' education. You go to Maker Faire, you see this everywhere. For those of you who think that this is some sort of hippie Renaissance festival, there'll be 150,000 people there this weekend. Parents who pay 40 or 50 bucks to take their kids to a place where they can learn together. And if you were to survey the parents and children at Maker Faire, you will find what we learned, which horrified us. You will find almost unanimity that school is no longer viable. The children and the parents you speak to have moved well beyond school is boring to saying it's killing my child. It's draining their soul. And then they point to what the kids are capable of doing and say, the school doesn't give a damn. The school doesn't know that this is happening, and they disrespect my kid and what they're capable of doing, and it's no longer viable. Now, I'm not willing to give up on schools because that's where the kids are. If every kid was lucky enough to have parents who could teach them everything they needed to know, then we wouldn't be necessary. But this is not only a provocation, it's an opportunity for us to embrace the technology and the ethos and the passion, the materials, the spirit of the maker movement and bring it into classrooms. We used to have hammers and nails in classrooms. We used to, I was at the last class of people wanting to become elementary school teachers in New Jersey who had to learn how to play the piano a little bit and teach science and phys ed and make puppets out of Pop-Tart boxes. And in the mid-1980s, legislators all over the world said, hey, teaching ain't nothing. All we need to worry about is animal control and curriculum delivery. And then we find ourselves in our current situation. This is an opportunity to reverse that. One of the great things about the maker movement is everywhere you look, there are kids who are central to it, who are viewed as champions, as experts, who are cherished and heralded and respected and beloved, whether it's Kane of Kane's Arcade or my colleague Super Awesome Sylvia or Skylar St. Ledger or my friend Maddie Smith, who at 9 years old spent a couple days at Constructing Modern Knowledge a few summers ago teaching people how to solder. These kids aren't just embraced because they're precocious and cute, They're embraced because they know stuff and they have demonstrative expertise that's of value to the community. And they like being in the company of adults because they recognize the adults have expertise that's valuable to them. This is one of my favorite kids, Joey Huddy, nicely plugging our book. Joey's now 17. He has a blog that's called Look What Joey's Making, where he admonishes you to don't be bored, make something. And some of the things he makes are electronics kits for hobbyists that he designs and has manufactured, like the Joey Huddy #1 SMD LED Arduino shield. And if you don't know what that does, either do I. But it generates enough income for him to go to maker fairs all over the world and share what he knows with others. And those wristbands are the tickets of entry to Maker Faire. He just came back from Shenzhen, China. He's been to Rome. He'll be at Maker Faire this weekend. And if you were to meet Joey at Maker Faire, you would think he was the mayor of the place. If you go to his blog, and until recently he had an About Me page that listed the pathologies the school has labeled him with, and the drugs he's required to take in order to comply with school, and the fact that I'm not very good at multiplication. But he got famous a couple of years ago for this photo, when he brought his marshmallow can into the White House. And in fact, someone just made a YouTube video where they took a North Korean news broadcast and interspersed this picture, and they were talking about the North Koreans were warning their people about the evil Americans and their weapons, their new weapon systems. Joey was invited by the White House to be one of 6 Americans in the First Lady's box at the State of the Union address in February. He's inspired the White House to host their first Maker Faire this year. They haven't announced the dates yet, but it'll happen in 2014. And despite the fact that he says, I'm not all that good at multiplication, he's Intel's youngest employee in history. These kids are capable. We have them in our schools. We need to honor them. We need to find a way for them to flourish. And in fact, I have to say that before the White House discovered him, I employed him to be on the faculty of Constructing Modern Knowledge this summer. Because as the level of technological sophistication of people's projects keep increasing, I need more expertise, and he's the best expert I know. This is a photo I took at Maker Faire 2 years ago, the robot petting zoo, where parents queued up for their children to spend a couple minutes in the pen playing with robots that beeped and burped and squawked and blew bubbles and ran away. And if you watch toddlers interact with the robots, their behavior was indistinguishable from had it been a cow or a pig or a sheep or a lamb. And it reminds us of what Alan Kay said, Alan Kay being the person who invented the term personal computer, that technology is anything that wasn't there when you were born. To kids, this stuff isn't hard and worthy of study. It's part of their environment, and they expect it to be part of their learning experience and the learning environment. The best thing we can do for kids is to recognize that the world is changing and to create opportunities for them to spend as much time as possible with interesting adults. So I actually believe that making is a stance. It's a way of viewing the world. You know, I created this chart where we look from what's being called school reform, that's more teacher-centric, to making, which is student-centered, an emphasis on instruction versus an instruction on construction, race to the top versus flow, the idea of the classroom being about the teacher's time as opposed to it being our time, having unique experiences rather than standardized experiences, kids creating, being empowered, teaching to liberate and amplify rather than teaching to control, monitor, and deliver. And I think this requires us to take a stance about how do we believe that kids learn best and what do we want for our own children and for other people's children. And I think the Maker movement offers a great deal of inspiration for us to take their tools and their passion and energy and return it to classrooms. Now, a lot of people have read our book, and we've been quite humbled by the response, and an alarming number of them come up to me and say, your book inspired us to start a makerspace. And being one who's been known to bite the hand that feeds me, I have to restrain myself from saying, obviously you didn't read very carefully, because we want making, the stance, the ethos of making, to permeate every aspect of the classroom, every minute of the day, to have places where kids can have real experiences, as opposed to this bunker they visit every couple weeks, like the computer lab, which was a historical accident. Surely it's time to admit after 30 years the computer lab was a bad idea. But we know how it happened. A creative teacher got excited about this stuff. They bought one with their Visa card. They brought it into their classroom. Other kids and parents got excited. Principal said, we need to get more of these. The price came down a little bit. Well, not all the teachers shared that enthusiasm. What are we going to do? We'll take the teacher out of the classroom. We'll put her in the bunker. We'll secure the machines. And it'll be like, bi-weekly trip to Colonial Williamsburg. I like to say that the best makerspace is between your ears. It's the stance that knowledge is the result of experience, and that we construct knowledge actively through doing, and that we should have the materials and the headspace and the time and the support available for making to occur everywhere. So let's look at what some of this technology looks like in practice. I'm only going to show one example of an adult talking about it. It's Alan Alda from a from a Scientific American Frontiers episode on PBS, where he visits Neil Gershenfeld. Neil Gershenfeld is a professor at MIT. He's the director of the Center for Bits and Atoms. He wrote a book about 10 years ago called Fab, in which he predicted that the next major technological innovation was going to be desktop manufacturing, personal fabrication. That for the price of what your school paid for its first computer in the 1980s, you can now have a lab in your school or on your desktop that will allow you to make the technology you use to solve other problems, to make the technology you need. The idea being that in the past, if you wanted to buy a watch for your father for his birthday, you would have to get off work early enough to get to the shops before they closed, hope they had what you wanted in stock, exchange currency for it. Now you can go online, order the watch, have it delivered to your father, but that in the near future, you may go online, find 2 or 3 watches you like, combine the best features of each, put a picture of the grandchildren on the face, and email the watch to your father. And this idea of fabrication, Gershenfeld said, was going to be the next major technological innovation. I think some of this has happened even quicker than he had anticipated. But in this little clip, you're going to see an example of what this looks like. And then I'm going to take you through some examples of what it looks like in the hands of kids and teachers. Hopefully the volume's loud enough here.
If I had one of these machines at home, you could email me this bike.
My sister actually was emailed this bicycle in Sydney, and she's riding one around.
You're kidding.
No, seriously.
Isn't that incredible? So wait a minute. So that means that if I order a bike from a company someday, it won't come in a truck. It'll come, everybody will have one of these machines, and a lot of what we order, lamps, furniture, bicycles, will get emailed to us. We'll have it a few seconds later.
The only thing wrong in what you said is it's not when you order the bicycle, it's when you design the bicycle. When you design the bicycle.
Okay.
Did you recognize what this is?
This is actually a model of Matisse's Blue Nude #2. You can see the leg here, the hind leg, another leg here and the thigh, the arch of the back, the head, and the hand holding the front wheel.
In this How to Make Anything project, it's not just that students learn to make a bicycle, they learn to make their bicycle. Every bicycle is different, and part of expressing yourself in the bicycle you want is what this is all about.
Okay, all right, this will be great. Listen, work on that thing for me. So off I went on what is certainly the first nude bicycle.
So if you can't get your head around designing a bicycle that's in the shape of a Matisse nude, or emailing it to your holiday destination so you can print it and ride it when you arrive, I think there are some really serious educational implications in this example. Not only does this blur the artificial boundaries between subject areas, it dissolves the distinctions between what we traditionally considered art and science and technology and engineering and mathematics and humanities, but it completely, fundamentally obliterates the cleavage between what we consider to be vocational and academic education. When these same tools and processes and techniques are found and required in the physics lab, the art studio, and the auto shop, we can stop sorting kids into winners and losers. I have a brother-in-law, great guy, Joe. He went to high school with me. He's my age, he was in my class, but I didn't know him because he dropped out. Now, dropping out of my high school was like a Bigfoot sighting. How hard could it have been? I got through it. But he had various family issues, and he dropped out of high school. And his life has had this sort of, predictable trajectory as a result. He works hard to eke out a living. He's great with his hands. He can make things. He can build things. He can fix things. He works in a car dealer auto body shop. And he has two sons, my nephews, who are university bound. They're in high school now. And I took the three of them to Maker Faire in New York last September. And as we were walking around Maker Faire and seeing all the cool laser printers and 3D printers and Arduino microcontrollers and great projects people were working on, Joe really dug the stuff, but then he got kind of melancholy and said, you know, my kid's school will never be able to afford any of this stuff. He was lamenting that his kid's school would never be able to afford any of this stuff. And what I was able to say to my brother-in-law with a reasonable degree of confidence is, your kid's school probably already has a bunch of this stuff. The problem is that your college-bound sons will never see that wing of the building. Because doing things with your hands is where we send other people's children. And the future is going to require that we equally value learning with our head, hands, and heart, when in the past we've only valued the learning with one's head. Now, the first time I heard Arduino or laser cutter used in a sentence was from my daughter, who was an art major at Bard College. And she had done projects like she knitted a sweater that hugged you as you approached and things. And one of the stories that I like to tell when I'm working in competitive type A type schools is, of my 3 adult children, all of them with college degrees, the only one who has been living on her own and fully employed every minute since she graduated college was the art major. Maybe we should do everything we can to help our kids get through school without hating it, to find stuff that they love, that they could be good at. And then the career stuff will sort itself out or not, but there's very little control we have over it anyway. I've heard that fewer than 25% of people with 4-year degrees work in that field. So you might as well do something you love. Speaking of love, I love this kid, super awesome Sylvia. She's a great friend and colleague of mine. I discovered her about 4 years ago when she was 8. She's now 12, going on 13. When she was 7, she went to her first Maker Faire. She got so excited about making things and engineering and science technology projects that she decided to create a show for the web that's modestly called Super Awesome Sylvia's Super Awesome Maker Show, in which she inspires learners of all ages to work on do-it-yourself projects. I've been working on a secret project with her. In fact, we're announcing it this weekend at Maker Faire. We have a session called Super Awesome Sylvia's Super Awesome Top Secret Project. And that's the entire description as well, and they accepted it. But she's clearly in command and in control, and she's a terrific little kid, like lots of other terrific little kids. And I want to share with you just a couple minutes of a highly edited segment of one of her shows in which she's talking about projects you can do with the Arduino microcontroller. I don't have one with me. The Arduino is this kind of revolution in robotics and physical computing. It's a $25 open source piece of hardware that allows you to connect motors, lights, sensors to the thing and create machines that interact with the world. The open source nature of it means that people are free to modify it, to embellish it. If you're a kid in Soweto and you can find enough broken appliances and the plans for it online, you can make your own Arduino. And it's being used by hobbyists and professionals alike. The good news is that for about $25, you get an awful lot of technology and that it's increasingly changing and improving. The bad news is that it's increasingly changing and improving. So you need to know something about it. If you want to use this stuff in the classroom, you're going to have to understand it, because if you bought blue ones this month, they're going to be red next month, and it might be white the month after that, and the inputs might be where the outputs were. I go to a lot of schools where well-meaning and well-intentioned, enthusiastic, passionate teachers tell me, I get all this stuff and I let the kids just run with it and they do all these amazing things. And when they sort of calm down, I often say, you know, it would be even better if you knew something. Because if you knew something, you had some expertise, some experience with the stuff, you'd be able to actually help the kids. You'd be able to help them go further. You might throw an obstacle in their way that'll create a teachable moment. You may anticipate a bug that they're going to encounter. So this technology is kind of messy, but it's wicked cool, and it allows us to do things that weren't possible before, to connect all sorts of electronics and such when a Lego set now has been reduced to building a truck that kills other people's trucks. So let's watch a little bit of Super Awesome Sylvia. Put on your teacher as researcher hat and think about what she knows and what she demonstrates, more importantly, that she's capable of doing.
Sylvia, super awesome, make a show. Go on now, gotta see this. Oh yeah, you're gonna love it. Da 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 dee da da. Sylvia show's really, really cool. Go on now, gotta see this. Oh yeah, you're gonna love it. Da 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 dee da. Sylvia, super awesome, make a show. Yeah! For our first project, we'll be making an adjustable strobe. For this flashy build, we will need an Arduino, any kind will do. We'll be using the Duomilanove 328, a computer and a USB cable to upload to the Arduino, a bright LED. I chose blue because it's cool, but you can use any color you want. And finally, a potentiometer, if you have one. You can make this without it, but it's cooler with one. First, take your Arduino and push the LED into pins 13 and ground. Now it's time for SmartBot's Thinking Lab, where we try to explain how things work. LEDs, or light-emitting diodes, are really just diodes that emit light. Electricity will only flow through them in one direction. When electricity flows in the right direction, you get light. Hi. Now take your potentiometer, take the first lead and plug it into 5 volts. Now take the last lead and attach it to ground. Then take the middle lead and push that into one of the analog pins. I chose pin 2 because it's the coolest of the analog pins. I'm cool. This allows you to very carefully send a voltage between 0 and 5 volts to analog pin 2. This value is read by the Arduino as a number between 0 and 1023. Then using a little math, this number becomes the delay value for our strobe. Now we take the source code available at tn42.com/strobe and upload it to the Arduino. Now that our code is compiled and uploaded, we can experiment. Here's one of my desk fans. We remove the front grille so we can see it better. Now we just turn on the Arduino and turn off the lights. By turning the potentiometer, it looks like it changes the speed of the fan, eventually slowing it down to a crawl. It's really still moving pretty fast though, so don't touch it. If you don't have a potentiometer, you can substitute any number you want for the analog read value in the code. It won't be easy to change, but with some trial and error, you can have it tuned in no time. The code me and my dad made is open to any number of adjustments in range, speed, and output. You can even add a display to guess the RPM of spinning objects. The possibilities go on and on. Another...
Okay. That's 8. When she gets to high school, she can be required to take a keyboarding class where there's a test on whether you can identify the space bar and the return key. We've spent billions of dollars creating a generation of 5th graders with fabulous secretarial skills by teaching them menu options in Word. This is certainly better than making a PowerPoint presentation on a topic you don't care about for an audience you're never going to meet. She has a couple million viewers. And there's this lovely moment in the clip where she says, in order to make the light flash at a particular rate, you control the voltage that goes to the microcontroller between 0 and 5 volts, and you do that by writing a computer program in which you use a value between 0 and 1023, and then using a little math, you can determine a delay value for the strobe. That's the entire K-8 math curriculum, anywhere in the world. If a kid understands that, they're well and truly done. If you cared nothing more than getting kids to learn the crummy math that's in the existing curriculum, you would teach kids to program, because it's the only context in which any of it has any meaning. I was in a 6th grade class in Los Angeles last year, and a teacher was giving a lesson on absolute value, and at the end of the class, I asked the teacher, what would you use that for? And she shrugged and said, I don't know, I suppose maybe 7th grade. You know, but you use it all the time when you're programming. You know, I fell in love with programming in the 7th grade because I attended a public school in New Jersey where every 7th grader was required to take a 9-week computer programming class in 1975. For the first time in my life, I felt intellectually powerful. I developed habits of mind that allow me to view problems from different perspectives, to put myself in the beaker with the molecules, to engage in debugging processes, that if I have some hypothesis, I communicate it to the computer. If I'm successful, I'm motivated, inspired to test a large hypothesis, ask a bigger question, embellish, enhance, decorate my work. If I'm unsuccessful, I have to engage in some debugging processes. And yet, we've removed that experience from far too many kids' lives. I know, we have hour of code now. I keep waiting for an hour of algebra or hour of 5-paragraph essay. You know, I've been wondering for decades, under what conditions could this change? Could this anti-intellectualism and fear of computation be overcome? Because particularly in this region in the United States, we had thousands of teachers teaching kids to program 25 years ago. Dan Watt's book, Learning with Logos, sold over 100,000 copies. If 10% of the teachers used it, there were 10,000 teachers in America teaching kids to program. This isn't impossible. But for some reason, there's this anti-intellectualism that leads us to say things like, well, not every kid needs to be a programmer. You know, not everyone needs to know how to build a car engine in order to drive a car. And aside from that being an incredibly stupid analogy, you know, my daughter fell in love with knitting and crocheting when she was 14. And no one ever said to her, hey, Yvonne, why are you knitting that hideous scarf? You could buy a better one at Target for 1/3 of the price. And that was because there was an aesthetic associated with making things with your hands that hasn't existed in the digital world. And what I think is really exciting now is the opportunity to change that. That a lot of these intellectual skills, these more computational skills, are coming to life through the connection to physical material. Materials that we have a conversation with, that we engage with, that we have an intimate relationship with. You know, programming doesn't have to look like your, you know, dystopian science fiction view of it. It could be through environments like turtle art, where you use formal mathematical expression to create beautiful works of art, where a minute of instruction can have 3rd graders on fire about geometry in a way that you've never seen before. And in fact, I was working at a school recently where I taught 3rd, 6th, and 10th grade students exactly the same things using exactly the same software. And their working knowledge, their working mathematical ability was indistinguishable between 3rd and 10th graders. This was a very competitive school with good test scores. You should find it horrifying if your 3rd graders and 10th graders have the same math skills. Real mathematics, not this sort of stuff we teach based on worksheets. You know, Turtle Art allows you in a Scratch-like interface to create a little program. In this case, it creates a program that's randomly drawing lines on the screen of random colors in random places. And if you just change the program slightly, that instead of doing it forever, you're going to repeat it a finite number of times. Now, instead of getting that blob of color, you start getting something that looks more like a Mondrian or a Klee. That you can say, oh, I wonder if, and you can change a variable and see how the behavior will change. This could be part of the world of kids, where they can use mathematics in service of something that's aesthetically pleasing, of something that's beautiful to them. This kid was explaining to his school principal this incredibly elaborate project he had created in Turtle Art. He was a 6th grader. I could tell very quickly he had really powerful insights into programming, even though he had never done any of it before. And he was explaining his program to his school principal with remarkable precision and mathematical clarity, but then every so often he said, and then it teleports. And I kind of loved that because it was kind of in the spirit of childhood. And then he turned to me and said, hey, Gary, what's this x coordinate mean? And what was great about that teachable moment was he had been using coordinates fluently for days. He just didn't have the definition. And in that moment, I could give him a definition that would stay with him for a lifetime, as opposed to the traditional math curriculum, which is all about memorizing vocabulary and never having actual mathematical experiences. Here's another kid. I'll call Hugo. He built a vehicle so that when he clapped his hands, it would go forward, clapped his hands, it would stop. So he had to deal with some interesting engineering challenges, controlling for ambient noise, so if someone coughed, his robot wouldn't go flying. He had to deal with inequality greater than and less than. And if you ask kids to actually use inequality, they kind of scrunch up their face and go, is the crocodile's mouth that way or that way? Because they don't actually have any working understanding of it, they just remember a trick. And then I got involved with some other kids and lost track of what he was doing, and he had gotten himself a piece of paper and a clipboard. He had a calculator under the chair, which you can't see in the photo, and a yardstick, because we're still taking a wait and see on that whole metric deal. And he had changed his program that so instead of clapping his hands and having it go forever, when he clapped his hands, the vehicle would just go forward for 1 second and stop. And he would write down how far it traveled, and he would do it again. So I know for a fact, because I worked in his school a lot, he wasn't taught multiple trials in class. This is just something he knew. And the question he was trying to answer is fairly obvious, right? He wanted to know how fast his car was going. That's traditionally where the fun and games end and several years of torturous unit conversions begin. Because if I asked all of you to tell me what 31 inches per second was in miles per hour, you would run screaming from here. You'd be in Lake Champlain in 5 seconds. So instead of asking him to do the torturous unit conversion, I took a chance. I opened up my laptop and went to Wolfram Alpha, wolframalpha.com. I typed 31 inches per second in. It told me that it was 787 millimeters per second, 0.787 meters per second, 1.76 miles per hour. Bingo, he's got his answer. And then it gave me something that I hadn't anticipated. It said comparison of speed, that's 0.7 of a typical human walking speed of 2.5 miles per hour. Before I could finish reading that line, Hugo was back to work on his project. Doing what? Trying to make it go faster than a human walks. For those of you who suggest that this is cheating, I look around the room, about 40% of you are wearing eyeglasses, you cheaters. We use technology every day to go about our lives, and no one accuses us of cheating. Call me a cockeyed optimist, a utopian who actually believes that in my lifetime we're going to get past the arguments over whether kids can have calculators in the classroom. I know. What if all the batteries run out and the solar ones can't be charged because the sun is blocked for an indefinite period of time? Well, you know what? If the sun is blocked for an indefinite period of time, you probably should worry about the apocalypse and drop the math homework. The lesson here is that if you make simple things easy to do, you make complexity possible. When you allow the learner to know what they need to know, when they need and want to know it, they're able to go further than they would be able to go otherwise. So I know you're thinking, Gary, what about the curriculum? Sure, you could show us 5-year-olds building dancing robot ballerinas and 10th graders learning about Lady Macbeth by composing a symphony that brings her character to life, and kids as authors and historians and genealogists, but that's not in the curriculum. Well, how about this? Fractions. Right? This is a bit of nonsense we torment kids with for several years. I walked into a 5th grade class where I saw on the blackboard for the 8th consecutive month, learn your fractions or whatever, and my head exploded. And I said to the kids, the first kid writes a program in MicroWorlds that allows me to type any fraction in, and I'm going to type some hard ones in, and draws representation of that fraction as parts of a circle I'll take out to lunch. I wasn't sure if I was allowed to do that. Kid raised their hand and said, can we work together? I said, sure. And 2 days later, 3 10-year-old girls handed me this program. The math curriculum, ladies and gentlemen, only wants kids to be able to identify the numerator and the denominator. That's all they expect of them. And we spend years on that. These kids are dealing with division and variable and radius and circumference and iteration and a whole bunch of other concepts, and in one couple of day period, they're able to actually solidify a real working understanding of fractions as being parts of a whole, as being some sort of representation that they wouldn't have gotten in any other means. Like I said, if we only cared about kids being more successful at the existing curriculum, we would teach kids to program. It provides the only meaningful context for much of what's actually in the math curriculum. And more broadly, it allows kids to be mathematicians, to have experiences with mathematical thinking. When kids are making stuff, they're reporting to us over and over again things like, everything seems more simple, I think something is complicated, but then I just break it down into parts, I shouldn't give up on an idea. And we hear this among teachers too, and you start seeing folks kind of moving their body and getting funny tics when they're successful, where they get lost in the flow of solving something. That this isn't just a way of learning content, it's a way about learning, and about learning about one's capabilities, and gaining the confidence and competence to solve the problems that your teachers never even anticipated. That ought to be the goal of school, right? That a kid who graduates from your school is able to solve a problem that you never even thought of, let alone taught them how to solve directly. That they learned how to learn. A friend of mine shot this in a classroom a couple months ago. The kids are just working with traditional Lego materials, but watch the little blonde boy. He doesn't know he's being filmed. You want to talk about flow? Look how unself-conscious this kid is about screaming, "I'm the boss," in the middle of the class. And how no one even takes notice of it because they're all equally lost in what it is that they're doing. You know, we talk breathlessly about how kids have short attention spans and, you know, have attention deficit disorder, and not when they're doing something that matters to them, not when they're engaged in something meaningful, and particularly when they're making something. Now, lest you think that this is just summer camp arts and crafts, this is the slide I show parents in international schools in Mumbai and Hong Kong. This is the vice president of admissions at MIT who's been traveling to maker fairs over the last 2 years, telling parents and their kids, we want your kids at our school. The most elite universities, particularly engineering schools, want makers, not just because of the demonstrative knowledge that these kids have and the expertise that they possess, but because they've been willing to learn something without being coerced to do so. That MIT added a space on their application to tell us about what you've made because they recognized that these were things that kids did without getting a grade for it, because they wanted to. They demonstrated an ability and willingness to learn and to learn. And I think that's a really nice positive trend. I'm not one of these people who says not every kid should go to college. I think we should prepare every kid to make whatever choice is right for them. What I am against is lying to kids about what that means to go to college. That college is some place where you sit in a lecture hall with 2,000 other people and take notes and have quizzes and tests. When there is many different kinds of college experiences as there are colleges, whereas a friend of mine said there are 10 schools in America that are hard to get into and 3,000 others where you can get a really good education. And it's refreshing that some of our most elite institutions are recognizing the power of learning by making. And, you know, this leads me to ask a question that I often think about. I'm winding down on time. I have to go quickly through this. I go to a lot of conferences where friends of mine say, we did this for 2 minutes or 2 days or 2 hours or 2 periods or 2 weeks, and look what the kids are capable of, and look how their test scores went up. And I think to myself, well, then it must not be that hard to raise test scores. But more importantly, when do kids get to do something longer than the period of an antibiotic? The course of an antibiotic. And there's a book written by Angelo Petri called The Schoolmaster of the Great City. He was a teacher and school principal in New York. He emigrated here from Italy. And in 1917, he wrote this book called The Schoolmaster of the Great City, which identifies and solves every problem in education today. And he said, I do not remember the school ever staying with a beautiful idea long enough to have it become an important part of children's lives. You know, if we want kids to learn, we have to create conditions for teachers to learn. I mean, look at that photo from Constructing Modern Knowledge last year, where these teachers are engaged in what Papert called hard fun, where they're having a ball and they're creating this sort of Rube Goldberg-like marble maze with a makey and scratch program and a whole bunch of other stuff while delighting in the process. We can't behave as if the children are competent if we believe their teachers are incompetent. And you can't teach 21st century learners if you haven't learned this century. We need to do unto ourselves what we'd have our students do. I want to skip a couple slides for the sake of time. Let me show you this real quickly. Now, these are just some of the images from Constructing Modern Knowledge last year, where we create a context for teachers to learn with the materials, with the luxury of time, and a supportive culture where they can go further than themselves. I coined a phrase I call a good prompt is worth 1,000 words, that says that if you have a good prompt, sufficient time, supportive culture, and appropriate materials, you can solve problems that are bigger than yourself. And over again, we see that teachers are capable. What breaks my heart is that school districts pat themselves on the back for sending their teachers to Twitter training or how to use their textbook. When year after year after year, we have teachers demonstrate in our workshops, and particularly at CMK, that they're capable of inventing things that 2 years ago would have earned them a spot on the TED stage, and 5 years ago would have earned them an engineering PhD. And engineering is critical. It's something that we haven't talked enough about in schools. It's a concrete manifestation of theoretical principles. We have some idea, we test it. If it works, we embellish it, we improve upon it. If it doesn't work, we take it apart, we engage in some debugging processes. Kids are natural tinkerers, natural bricoleurs, natural engineers. And if we had engineering experiences from the youngest grades, we would create a more meaningful context for kids to learn the math and science that we expect of them. And what I'm talking about isn't just limited to math and science. It's about kids having experiences about making things, whether it's composing music or making films or being historians or writing novels. This is a photo last year of Norm at Constructing Modern Knowledge, and that's the expression we captured when we said, "No, Norm, you can't take your robot home." And what I love about that image is it's indistinguishable from the reaction on a 4-year-old. And you know, learning is learning regardless of your age. This is on the left. These teachers drew a circulatory system, a digestive system on a t-shirt using conductive thread, the makey, some snaps to make contact. They were able to point to places on their body and have a video play on the screen that described the anatomical system. Now, at a certain level, this is the same crappy science fair project that you put on a poster board. On another level, it's a lot more intimate than that. It's a lot more personal. It's a lot more complex. On the right is a teacher who had never done anything with computers before, a music teacher who built a harp using conductive thread and a purloined hotel luggage trolley. And she not only made this amazing thing, but she was able to demonstrate it to one of her heroes, Eleanor Duckworth, the great Piagetian educator. This was a 3D scanner made by a gentleman out of Lego's K2 robotic system called WeDo, a chip and dip plate, and Scratch. We thought he was out of his mind when he told us he was going to do this, and it worked. He controlled for the Z-axis by knocking a block out of the Lego tower. Teachers are capable of doing this kinds of stuff, and when teachers develop expertise and are able to share their commitment and passion and enthusiasm for learning with their students, it becomes infectious, and the students learn to learn from them. The best piece of advice I can give any of you is less us, more them. Whenever confronted with some educational transaction, we ought to take a deep breath and ask ourselves, is there less that we can do and more that the student can do? Can we give more agency, shift more responsibility to the learner? I want to end with this last example. On the left, you're going to see work done by kids in the state prison for teenagers where I conducted my doctoral research for 3 years in the early 2000s, where the most at-risk kids in society had 5 hours a day uninterrupted to work on personally meaningful projects. And this project in particular was to build digital gingerbread houses. What could be better than computers and icing? And we had cookies and icing and lights, and kids made spinning trees and Christmas carols and lights that flashed and burglar alarms and doorbells and things in their gingerbread house. The gingerbread house on the right-hand side was created in an expensive private school in Los Angeles last year that I was working with. And in that 5th grade class, I wasn't pretending that this would get you into Yale or Princeton. It's just a nice thing to do with 10-year-olds in December. And while I was helping the kids build their digital gingerbread houses, the door of my classroom popped open a crack. And I saw the director of admissions head pop in. I said, "Come on, you're welcome. I'm not afraid to have anyone come visit while I'm teaching." And she said, "I've got a lot of people with me." I said, "That's okay, they're welcome as well." And in came about 30 people, 30 adults. It turned out it was an admissions tour. They were trying to help these parents decide whether they were going to spend $25,000 a year or not, a year to send their kids to the school and trust the school with their kids. And they spent 5 or 10 minutes on our sprinkle and icing orgy, and then left. And I didn't think anything of it until later in the day. I was walking down the hall, and I heard the director of admissions yell, "Hey, thanks a lot, pal," out of the office. And I stopped in my tracks. I thought, okay, Steger, now what have you done? And she came out and said to me, you know, I had to spend over an hour trying to convince those prospective parents that that wasn't staged for their benefit. And that was a really nice moment for me because it reminded me that maybe parents don't give a damn about the Common Core, or how if their kids can use all their spelling words in a sentence, or if they're better at long division than kids in Helsinki. Maybe, just maybe, parents want their kids to come home from school happy, and when they're asked, what did you do today, they don't say nothing, and they have some story to tell, and maybe in that story is embedded some wisdom about what they learned, some insight about something they did. And that sort of really fuels me, and it's inspired
Totally different.
go forward. And I'm going to end with this one last example. There's a lot of talk these days about personalized learning. And aside from the fact that most of the people who talk about learning, particularly policymakers, have a really hard time differentiating between differentiating between teaching and learning, and that they think learning is the direct consequence of having been taught, that learning has sort of become a noun. It's like a contagion. If you're just in a room with enough learning, you'll catch it. And the fact that much of what's being sold as personalized learning is really just a new multiple choice quiz question based on how well you performed on the last one. I recognize that school also has a responsibility to expose kids to things that they don't yet know they love. You know, I go to a lot of private schools where the principal says to me, and we have a rock band. I think, oh, that's terrific. Do you have a rock band in addition to a really strong choral and instrumental music program? No, we just have a rock band. And I want to say to these folks, well, did the kids play Bach in their garage? And I had an argument with young Zhao about this, because he said to me, well, what if the kids care more about Lady Gaga than Bach? And I said, well, Lady Gaga can take care of herself. I think school has a responsibility to expose the kids to things they don't know that they love yet, and a responsibility to be part of a cultural continuum that preserves our best traditions. And that rather than personalized learning, which I think is kind of this form of pandering or this way of automating education or reducing it to multiple choice questions, maybe we ought to talk more about intimate learning. I was working at the American School of Bombay. They asked me if I would teach 70 10th graders for 3 hours. We'd set up makey-makeys and Arduinos and all kinds of different things. And I showed all the kids turtle art for a couple of minutes, and then they were able to choose what they wanted to work on. They were able to work with their friends. There was a lot of giggling and making things and high-energy activity going on everywhere. And then I noticed there was this one 15-year-old girl who was sitting in the corner almost defiantly by herself with her laptop programming and programming and programming. She had never done any programming before that day. And she spent 3 hours working on something. And I'm really blessed that she was willing to share with us what she was working on, because I found it really interesting that despite all this other social learning that was going on, she had something important on her mind that she wanted to express mathematically through this computing environment, through this programming language called Turtle Art. And it reminds us of something that Papert used to say a lot when we were working with kids, is that love is a better master than duty, or nothing beautiful is forced. And when his girl finally revealed to us what her incredibly elaborate program did, this is the result. That the turtle drew in perfect symmetrical proportionality, I love you. And I was really moved by that. And I thought, you know, when you're 15, sometimes stuff matters more than isosceles triangles. Maybe she had some other stuff on her mind. And she was able to use what we had taught her and the environment that we provided and the experience that we have offered to do something deeply intimate, to engage in learning in a really powerful way. You know, some of you remember baking cookies and singing songs and making puppets out of Pop-Tart boxes and taking field trips and building medieval castles and Trojan horses in the classroom and math manipulatives and Cuisinart rods and plants and microscopes. I go into a lot of schools now where I ask myself the question, if I walked in on a Saturday, would I know there were ever kids here? Where everything in the place but the children is laminated, you know, so it can survive nuclear winter. Where everything on the wall is created in the handwriting of an adult. I was in a school recently where the rules and schedule for using the comfy chair were laminated. You know, like someone actually spent the time laminating the comfy chair rules. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, is there, you know, this is of importance. I thought, you know, when the comfy chair is empty, you sit in it. When it's not, you negotiate a time to sit in it. But we've created these incredible structures that limit the capability of kids. And those of us who remember all that stuff that I just mentioned have a special obligation to return it to our classrooms tomorrow, along with computing and robotics and filmmaking and music composition and all the wondrous stuff that the technology now empowers. Not just for the kids that we have the privilege of serving, but for a generation of colleagues who don't know that it's possible. As educators, we need to educate everyone in our community, kids, teachers, parents, colleagues, the jerk next to you at the pub tonight. And as a result, it'll make teaching and learning more fun, more rewarding for all of you. You know, you just went through a rough winter. It's a gloomy Saturday morning. Maybe you hit the snooze alarm 50 or 60 times, and you roll out of bed and you think to yourself, boy, I really need that cup of coffee to get the weekend started. And you reach for the carton of milk and it's empty, or it's gone rancid because you didn't have a chance to go to the shop all week. You were having parent-teacher conferences or coaching volleyball or running your kids to ballet lessons. And you throw on a hat and a coat and rush off to the local Quickie Mart, and as you walk out, trying to congratulate yourself for having gone unnoticed, a former student sees you from across the parking lot, comes running towards you with their arms open wide, and they want to give you a big embrace. And just as you're about to hug, you turn your head because maybe you didn't brush your teeth yet, or you're having a bad hair day. And that student wants to reminisce, and they never reminisce about cramming for some standardized test. They want to talk about some project that you engaged them in. Because projects are the unit of learning. They're the way that memories are created. And that I think the highest, noblest calling for teachers is to be in the business of making those memories. And the best way to do that is to create rich project-based experiences for kids. And we've never had cooler stuff to allow for a broader, deeper, more expressive range of projects to be possible than ever before. I thank you for your good humor and the work that you do on behalf of kids. If anyone's interested, I've got some copies of my book for sale, and there's going to be a follow-up conversation later on. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.